Welcome to Kent Channel. Today I'm going to discuss something which I have studiously avoided discussing over the years, but I think it's very timely now. It's precisely 75 years since the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs, one on Hiroshima and one on Nagasaki, which of course brought about the end of the war quite quickly. But I think it's time for us to rethink this. There's been enough time elapsed, and we've had enough discussion, and we've seen the way the world has progressed since then, that I think we can look at this in a rational way. I believe there are 4 reasons why the bomb was dropped. First of all, I think it was fate. Mankind has a very bad habit. Whenever they produce something that is actually not good for them, they will still go ahead and use it, and they will reap the consequences of that. I think, the poisonous gases used in World War II was an example. A more direct example might be when you have a hot stove, you tell your child not to touch it. Don't touch the burner, you'll burn your hand. But a large portion of the children will go ahead and touch it anyway, and they burn their hand, and then they never do it again. I think once we started on the path of producing, and then of actually developing and then producing these bombs, I think fate almost dictated that they would be used somewhere by someone against someone else. We know, for example, that the United States was not the only country developing atomic weapons. The Soviets were developing atomic weapons, and so were the Germans. And I have very little doubt that if the Americans had not been first, but rather if the Soviets had produced a weapon before the end of the war, and before the United States did, in other words, if they were the first ones to produce it, I have little doubt that they would have used it against their enemy at the time, which probably meant that it would be dropped on Berlin. If the Germans had developed the atomic weapon first, I think there's a high probability that they would have dropped it on London. And I don't think they had the capacity to transport it to the United States at that point, but they probably would have dropped it on London, which would have been very effective. But the United States was the first to produce it, and by that time the war in Europe was over with, and America at that time was fighting Japan. So, as fate would have it, Japan became the country that got the bomb dropped on them. Now, I know that sounds like we don't have any morals, and maybe we don't. There are a lot of people who were involved in the development of the bomb who really felt a very moral, a very moral dilemma, and I'm not going to go into the details of that, but there are some people who actually dropped out of the program, and there's some people who spoke out against it at some point, and some of them beforehand, but some afterwards. And I think in the United States, most people, the older generation maybe not so much, but I think the younger generation has come to feel that this was a real moral issue, and something that we probably shouldn't have done. But at the time, in the moment, it is the nature of mankind to actually use things that are to its detriment. Now, some people have said, and this would be the second reason, some people have said, well, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they deserved it, that was a sneak attack. I don't go for that. First of all, it wasn't a sneak attack. The United States knew it was coming. We had the intelligence. The people on the ground in Honolulu were not given that intelligence, but the intelligence was there. We actually tracked the Japanese fleet after it left Japan and headed over there for a while. We had access to all of their codes, including their naval codes. And there are books out there that show that we actually had that information. There are others who say that, in a way, America drew Japan into the war, that maybe Roosevelt wanted Japan to attack us so that then the United States would have a reason to enter the war. Because as you'll recall, the citizens of the United States were almost universally opposed to entering World War II. They didn't like what happened in World War I, and they figured it was Europe's problem and not something they needed to be concerned with. But if you attack U.S. soil, as you will recall, overnight, the American public opinion took a total reversal, and "Remember Pearl Harbor" became the slogan that everybody was saying. Now, you may wonder about what I just said, about it, that the U.S. knew about it in advance. I believe they did, and I believe that they wanted Japan to attack us. I don't believe that they considered it inevitable that there would be a war with Japan, but the United States made it inevitable by their diplomacy, which they engaged in up until that time. And you can say, well, but Japan was doing all kinds of imperialistic things. They were fighting China. They had advanced into Southeast Asia. And so they were bad dudes. They needed to be taken out. Well, fine. Then you can go ahead and take them out. But this was, letting them attack Pearl Harbor. And, saying letting them attack Pearl Harbor, that sounds really bad. But I think that's what happened. People can argue with me, and you're welcome to do that. But I think we allowed them to start the war so that then we could come into the war, not only in the Pacific theater, but also in Europe, and therefore fight against Nazi Germany and Japan, Imperial Japan, and for that matter, Italy. But saying that because Japan started the war, let's just assume for a moment that Japan did start the war by bombing Pearl Harbor. Is the atomic bomb a proportional response? The law of proportionality says that the response needs to be proportional to the provocation. This applies in self-defense cases, in criminal law. It also applies to international law, especially if it involves a lot of collateral damage, civilians, innocent people, their possessions, and all of that. And if it's considered to be excessive when weighed against the amount of military advantage which may be gained. It isn't like this is the first time America violated the principle of proportionality in Japan. During the summer of 1945, there were some really horrific firebombing raids in Tokyo. One night, over 100,000 people died. Just carpet bombing. This carpet bombing started in Dresden, Germany, where it was pretty horrific. But General LeMay, who was in charge of this operation in Japan, actually said, if we don't win this war, I'm going to come out a war criminal. He understood that what he was doing was actually in violation of the laws of war. Excuse me. So I don't think the atomic bomb was a proportional response. They started it, so they deserve it. I don't subscribe to that. In the first place, it sounds quite racist, and we know that there was some pretty non-proportional actions taken against Japanese Americans in the United States, people who were American citizens but happened to be of Japanese ancestry. And all of those on the continental U.S. basically were put in concentration camps for the duration of the war, ostensibly to prevent spying. And it prevented spying. I don't know how much spying there would have been otherwise. It's interesting that the Japanese Americans in Hawaii were not placed in concentration camps because there were too many. It just wouldn't work. So that was, we ended up paying those people reparations later because it was clearly unconstitutional. It was ruled constitutional at the time, but afterwards everybody realized that was a horrible mistake, and so those people were paid reparations. It wasn't very much. I think each person got about $20,000, something like that, the ones who were still alive. The third reason is, and this is the main reason that people tend to give in the United States, and that is that the purpose was to end the war quickly and save the most number of lives. Well, it ended the war quickly. I'm not convinced that it saved lives, and I'll tell you why. I think the war could have been ended then anyway without dropping the bomb. Japan was on its knees. After the Battle of Okinawa, which I think ended in May of 1945, if I'm not mistaken, the Japanese Navy was totally decimated. They had virtually no warships. And their Air Force was totally depleted. Their capacity to build airplanes was more or less destroyed. Especially after all of the bombing raids on the Japanese mainland, which took place during the summer of 1945. Virtually all of Japan's military capacity was destroyed, except for just a few cities that they held back. I think they were probably because they wanted to use those to test the atomic bomb. So their capacity to resist was almost non-existent, except for the fact that they wanted to maintain their national polity. A national polity, in Japanese it's kokutai, in English it's national polity, and nobody has any inkling what it means, but it means the emperor. They wanted to maintain the emperor system. And if the United States had agreed to do that, I think Japan would have surrendered in July of 1945. And we wouldn't have had to drop any atomic bombs anywhere. But the United States was hell-bent on having an unconditional surrender, and allowing that would have not been a conditional, would have been a conditional surrender, which they didn't want. And also the United States was convinced, at least most people were convinced, that the emperor was behind the whole thing and that he could have stopped it. In the end, he actually did stop it, and almost he recorded the tape the night before, and before it was played, there was all kinds of attempts to destroy it and whatnot. So there were lots of radicals that didn't go along with that, and I don't think he really had the power to control the military. The military got totally out of hand back in the 1930s, and they just took over, and the emperor was... I'm not going to say he was a puppet, but I don't think he had really he may have had the authority, but I don't think he really had the power or the ability to rein in the military at that point. But if the existence of the emperor had been guaranteed, I think the Japanese had come to the point where they really would have had to give up. And they would have. I think they would have. There's one other thing here about this that I want to mention, and that is that there was one other thing that I want to mention, and some people may argue with this, but I think it was quite clear that the United States wanted to test this thing somewhere. And I suppose they could have tested it. They tested it in New Mexico, of course. They probably could have tested it on some remote island in the Pacific somewhere. But they wanted to see how it worked and see if it was really effective. Some people did. I wouldn't say that's one of the main reasons for dropping it. But it seems to be a fairly good reason for dropping the second one. If you recall, the first bomb was an uranium bomb. It was dropped over a relatively flat city. The second one was a plutonium bomb, and that was it was supposed to have been dropped on the city of what is now the city of Kitakyushu. They had some steel mills there. Unfortunately, it was cloudy. That would have also been a relatively flat target, although there are some mountains nearby. But it was cloudy, so they gave up, and as they were heading back, the clouds cleared over Nagasaki, so they dropped it at Nagasaki. Nagasaki has basically at the time, had basically no flat land, almost no flat land at all. It's all built on mountainsides around a deep water port. And I think there were some people who wanted to see how effective it would be. Again, I don't think that was a major reason. There were some people who wanted that, but I don't think Truman would have gone along with that. Dropping back to the issue of proportionality, after the first bomb was dropped, a senator by the name of I found all this information in the Truman Library, but there was a senator by the name of Richard Russell, and he wrote Truman a letter after the dropping of the first bomb, and he said, "You need to stop peace negotiations with the Japanese and just bomb the heck out of them. Just keep dropping those bombs until they give up." And this is what Truman wrote in response. "Dear Dick, I read your telegram of August 7th with a lot of interest." And August 7th was after the Hiroshima bomb, but before the Nagasaki bomb. "I know that Japan is a terribly cruel and uncivilized nation in warfare, but I can't bring myself to believe that, because they are beasts, we should ourselves act in the same manner. For myself, I certainly regret the necessity of wiping out whole populations because of the pig-headedness of the leaders of a nation, and for your information, I am not going to do it unless it is absolutely necessary. It is my opinion that after the Russians enter into war, the Japanese will very shortly fold up. My object is to serve as many American lives as possible, but I also have a human feeling for the women and children in Japan. Sincerely yours, Harry S. Truman." Now, that's in the archives. You can look it up and see it for yourself. I also wrote it in my book, Shono Kuni Nippon, and you can look at it there if you want. Harry Truman I think he had qualms about dropping the bomb, and he certainly didn't intend to keep dropping bombs. And I think he just didn't feel like he could get out of dropping the bombs that were already produced. There were only 2 bombs produced at that time. But I thought that was an interesting observation, clearly having to do with the principle of proportionality. Now, finally, the last reason I think the United States went ahead and dropped the bomb as quickly as they did was as a signal to the USSR. The USSR came into the war on August 15th. They had already agreed, they had actually a treaty with Japan that they wouldn't, but they went ahead and broke that. And they had already agreed with the United States that they would enter the war to end it quickly. I think Stalin and Roosevelt had agreed that they could have the northern territories of Japan. I don't think they were allowed to come down into Hokkaido, and they would split Korea. And so when the Russians came in, even though they came in late, they came in on the 15th when it was already, Japan had already given up, but they went ahead and took all those lands. The Japanese soldiers, to their credit, some of them fought, but most of them just went ahead and surrendered, and there was tremendous loss of life. Lots of women were raped. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese were carted off to Siberia, where they served as virtual slaves for several years before they were returned to Japan. So it was a bad ending, but I think dropping those 2 bombs made it very clear to the USSR who the big man on the block is now. The United States would now be the most powerful country in the world, and they would have to deal with that. So I think that at least it had that effect, and I'm sure that that was probably one of the motivations for dropping the bomb. Personally, I think dropping an atomic bomb on anybody is a human rights violation of the worst kind. It's a violation of the rules of war, and I don't think we should have done it, and I don't think we needed to do it. But it's done. And, from there, the Japanese have managed to rebuild. The United States went ahead and helped Japan rebuild. Japan has been a great ally, a peaceful nation, and we've had a great relationship with them over the years. And frankly, I'm going to tell you something here that I don't think I've ever discussed before in public, but when I first came to Japan, I came in 1971, at the end of 1971. And in 1972, I came as a missionary. I was here, it was a 2-year assignment. In 1972, I was assigned up near Hiroshima, and from time to time we would go to Hiroshima. And then after that, I was transferred down to Sasebo, which is in Nagasaki Prefecture. And from time to time, we would go to Nagasaki City. Not once during the entire time, and I was astounded at this, not once during that entire time did anybody, any Japanese person, look at me and say, "You're in America and you dropped the bomb on us. I hate you." Not once did I have that opportunity, or that opportunity, that experience. I was really worried before I came to Japan because I had been assigned to Western Japan, and my area included where both of the bombs had been dropped. And I just wondered how much of that kind of hatred I was going to have to deal with. But as a matter of fact, I didn't experience any. And I find that really astounding. Sometime I'd like to go into why that might be. But I have to say, it was really, really surprising to me that I never had that problem. I'll tell you one other thing that I don't usually discuss. May have not discussed it before anywhere, I don't think. In 1975, I came back to Japan to work for the government, and on my way home, I stopped off at the Hiroshima Peace Park, and I was looking through the museum there, and they had all these horrible pictures. And a young girl walked up to me. I was just looking at the horrible pictures, and she came up to me and she said in English, "How do you feel?" And I thought, oh, here's a girl trying to practice her English on me again. We got a lot of that in those days. But it hit me sort of like a ton of bricks, and I said to myself, how do I feel? How do I feel about this? And I have to tell you, in all honesty, up until that point, I hadn't really thought clearly about it. It was sort of like something that happened a long time ago, and it wasn't really relevant to me. But at that point, I realized that as a member of the human race, as a member of the United States, as a citizen of the United States, and as someone who is working toward better Japanese relations, I needed to think about this issue and see if I could come to terms with it. I have decided that, as I just stated, I don't think we should have done it, and I don't think we needed to, but I don't think it could be avoided. And I think, to their credit, Japan and the United States have made the best of it over the years, and we now have a very good relationship. And that's all I'm going to say about nuclear weapons at this time. We can discuss that at some other time, but I hope this has been somewhat enlightening. Anyway, that's my opinion on why the atomic bombs were dropped on Japan by the United States. Thank you for listening.